Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, August 23rd, 2017. Here's what we're putting together for today's show. Best we can do for you, taping ahead of time, taking a little time out from the vacation, trying to put together something that gives us a coherent narrative running up to, well, our return to live shows on Thursday morning. It is currently, for me, Tuesday evening, and probably all hell is breaking loose. I don't know what's going on out at the Phoenix, Arizona rally. I'm sure I'll be shocked, and I'll probably find some of it out as things go on. Maybe I'll open up the Twitter app and see if do I even dare dip my toe into this stuff and find out. I'm not certain what time they were starting locally, so maybe we have a little chance to catch up on things before we do that. Yesterday, when we left off, we were in the middle of reading the article about Bill Regnery, the money man behind the alt-right. And I usually don't do this and just pick up where I left off on the next day on the assumption that if it really interested you, you could, of course, follow the links. That's why we provide them every day. But maybe you were busy, too. And I'm interested in finding out. And damn it, I want to read the rest of this thing. And I didn't have time to do it earlier on my own time. So I'm going to, look, if you're here and I'm here, to quote that seminal film, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, doesn't it make it our time? And surely there's nothing wrong with a little feast on our time. And me, of course, finding out a little bit more about Bill Regnery and how he built his white nationalist empire. That is the next section. And speaking of the feast, I may drop dead at some point during the show. And we're just back from a dinner at the Brazilian Steakhouse, and oh my God, I'm going to die. It was fantastic. I'd do it again. And now that I've seen the eclipse, I guess it's okay for me to drop dead. How was the eclipse by you, by the way? We didn't talk about it yesterday. Too excited about getting directly into the articles we had for you. I was down in Charleston, South Carolina for the eclipse, and I'll tell you, it was about the worst luck you could possibly ask for. We were a little bit worried that we were going to have overcast weather, and we did at the time. And by the way, we know a guy who was so excited about the eclipse, he actually booked 4 different hotel rooms along the path of totality, everywhere from Charleston, South Carolina, westward into Kentucky, and who even knows where else, and was going to make a game day decision basically about who had the best looking weather, and then he was going to cancel the other reservations and just check into the one place. So I imagine he got a good view of things. We had no choice. But Charleston itself, of course, a fantastic place to visit. It was overcast, and someone somewhere around here has got a fantastic picture. I did mention it. Did I mention this yesterday? We had a thunderstorm rolling in, racing the eclipse, essentially. The first hour or so, the onset of the eclipse, was partly cloudy, and we could mostly see the sun being obliterated by the moon. And, of course, right at right at the totality, it actually, clouded over, and, there was thunder and lightning and everything. It didn't rain on us at the moment. But we were supposed to have something like 2 minutes and 40 seconds of totality, and we got about 30 seconds of visible totality out of it. It did grow dark, but it was so cloudy that it was sort of like, is it dark because it's cloudy or dark because the moon is obscuring the sun? Couldn't really tell, so that was a little bit annoying. But then I think the cloud cover actually made it possible for me to snap a photo with my iPhone without putting a filter over it or anything and get that totality and the ring around the moon. But it wasn't the visual effect we were hoping for. So we'll be striking out for Western Pennsylvania, I think, next time in 2024 and trying it all over again. Anyway, I hope the eclipse was spectacular wherever you were, even if it was only partial. It's always exciting. And this was sort of a fun national thing. And of course, you would have seen Donald Trump, international idiot, staring directly at the thing. But I admit to taking a glance or two toward the sun to try to line things up once or twice. I didn't stare at it, but I figured, I occasionally accidentally look the sun's way every once in a while, and I'm not blind yet. So as long as I don't stand here and try to look at it, I should be fine. But just for the purposes of lining up a camera, and I did try to I tried sticking the Eclipse glasses in front of the iPhone camera lens. That didn't work too well either. But anyway, so the president embarrassed us again, and who cares? Now he's probably in the middle of embarrassing us right now out in Phoenix, Arizona. But I'm going to turn back to the story of Bill Regnery. When we last left off, we were just getting to the section called Building a White Nationalist Empire. How do you do that? Let's find out. He called up, we're talking about Bill Regnery here, he called up Jared Taylor, founder of the American Renaissance magazine, who, by the way, his picture is here. They all look normal. That's just the banality of evil, I guess. He called up Jared Taylor, founder of American Renaissance magazine, which regularly publishes stories about black and immigrant crime. So that's where Breitbart gets it from. And once argued that black people, quote, are more psychopathic than whites. I don't know to whom he would argue such a thing, but I guess in print. Taylor had already convened conferences of other white nationalists. Regnery headed down to Kentucky to see him. Could have taken in the Eclipse while he was there. Oh, and by the way, yeah, that's the other story. We'll see if we can get back to that. Maybe we'll discuss that on Thursday. Kentucky and the Eclipse and the Mnuchin family. You're all, I'm sure, familiar by now with that story. Let me stick to what I'm doing here. Taylor had already convened conferences of other white nationalists. Regnery headed down to Kentucky to see him. He sought out Sam Francis, a one-time Washington Times columnist who went on to become chairman of an anti-immigration organization, and Sam Dixon, the Atlanta-based attorney who made his name defending members of the Ku Klux Klan. Note here, though, I'm just interested in the idea of a guy who was a Washington Times columnist who goes on to become a white nationalist. Gee whiz, how does that happen? I'm sure they were fair and balanced while he was writing there, right? Anyway, he invited them and roughly 10 others in December 1999 to a lavish Gatsby-era Florida resort, the Don Cesar, better known as the Pink Palace for its rose-colored towers and archways. Regnery had prepared a grandiose opening speech titled, For Our Children's Children, warning of an ominous future. Generation by generation, our kind will be winnowed out. Not such a bad thing. He closed with a vision of the North American population carved up along racial, cultural, and social lines. I am for the United States ceding territory to create smaller countries that are indivisible by reason of race, religion, or mutual interests, he declared. Interesting. I charge the participants of this conference with the sacred task of beginning to secure for our children's children a proper home. You don't run into a whole lot of white nationalists who are willing to cede American territory. That doesn't make him any better. It just makes him a different kind of kook, I guess. He led the way, playing a crucial role in the 2001 launch of the Charles Martel Society, which describes itself as the intellectual home of Western nationalism. Regnery never had formal criteria for which groups the organization should fund, he said. He simply knows what he likes. Regnery himself signed the Charles Martel Society's initial tax form and entirely covered the first year's budget of $48,000. There is embedded in the piece here a list of Regnery's donations to alt-right or white nationalist groups. Let's see. There are, I guess we should mention some of the names of these groups here. Western Shade, that was the donor to the Charles Martel Society. There's a Marquette Charitable, something or other, to Charles Martel. Western Shade, I don't really know what that is. But St. Lucas, Charles Martel gave money to the National Policy Institute. These are all sort of interlocking directorates of white nationalists, I guess. This, and it's labeled here, BuzzFeed News tracked publicly available donations from organizations William Regnery II has had control or influence over. Western Shade Company. It's Western Shade Company Charitable Foundation, Marquette Charitable Foundation, and St. Lucas Charitable Foundation are Regnery family foundations. The Charles Martel Society and National Policy Institute are white nationalist nonprofits. that Regnery helped to establish and fund. New Century Foundation is a white nationalist nonprofit run by Regnery ally Jared Taylor. Okay, the guy he went to Kentucky to see. Anyway, on with the story. People affiliated with the Charles Martel Society instantly clam up about it when asked. Taylor initially said, "I don't know about the Charles Martel Society." Later, when reminded that he is listed on the organization's paperwork as a founding member, he said, "My association with it is so old, I don't think I can talk about it." What does that even mean? Well, it's just a dodge. Richard Spencer, asked about it over lunch, abruptly changed the subject. "Excellent meal," he exclaimed. Wow, so they're sensitive and touchy about the Charles Martel Society. I'll try and remember that. It's a secret society. See, I belong to a certain secret society. I don't believe I gotta mention its name. It's a little bit like that, I guess. It's a secret society, explained Kevin McDonald, the only member who would discuss it. Only the board is public as required by law, he said. McDonald, who is a well-known white nationalist academic, writes frequently about Jews and says that they have a, quote, desire for the end of Europe as a Christian civilization with its traditional ethnic base. Sure, we talk about that all the time at the Brazilian Steakhouse. He is a retired professor at California State University at Long Beach. The Charles Martel Society members, he said, are bound by non-disclosure agreements. You have to sign a paper saying you will not divulge any information. If you did it, you'd be thwarted by a lawsuit. No, you wouldn't. You just have to pay a lot of money. And you're billionaires. So what are you worried about? But one thing that McDonald was happy to divulge, the group's racist precepts. From the beginning, he said, we stressed you had to be on board about race and you had to be on board about Jewish influence. Taylor, he said, is an outlier of the society meetings because he believes Jews are white and should be accepted. What an idiot, right? Regnery himself insists that the Charles Martel Society is not actually secret, but private and confidential. The society publishes Occidental Observer, a magazine that describes itself as covering white identity, interests, and culture. Like Wonder Bread, I guess. Mayonnaise. Mayonnaise Monthly is what you can call it. It also publishes the academic-sounding journal Occidental Quarterly, which features Regnery's For Our Children's speech in its first issue, and has articles such as The Case for Eugenics in a Nutshell. You're probably going to need more room than just a nutshell for a proper eugenics operation, but I'll leave that up to you. In 2005, Regnery and a group of his close associates launched a white separatist think tank, the National Policy Institute. And this becomes important. NPI started with $596,000, according to its initial tax filings, $380,000 of which came from the Charles Martel Society. Regnery told BuzzFeed News that about half the money for NPI came from him and that the rest came from matching grants. Its very first press release in December of 2005 was a call for the deportation of all illegal immigrants. Back then, it fell on deaf ears. Soon, Regnery met a young man named Richard Spencer, who then worked at the American Conservative magazine. You remember we learned about that as the result of the Thai restaurant luncheon, talking about Duke Lacrosse. Other than coming from a privileged background, Spencer seemed everything Regnery wasn't. Academically successful, I don't know about that, publicity hungry, and youthful. The two men hit it off. At that time, Regnery, together with his friend Gottfried, the right-wing author, the Jewish one that he thinks is maybe okay, remember him? They helped set up a group called the Academy of Philosophy and Letters. Spencer, too, was an early member, but their obsession with race soon put them at odds with the organization they had helped build. Spurned by the Academy, Spencer, Regnery, and Gottfried established a new group called the Mencken Club. These names they come up with. Why not just We're Racist? That's okay. You can use that. That was the place where the phrase alternative right was first used. Ooh, Spencer, you didn't make it up. I'm telling. According to Regnery, anyway, Spencer and Gottfried also, Spencer used it to title a speech by Gottfried, The Decline and Rise of the Alternative Right. In 2010, Regnery asked Spencer to find candidates to lead the organization. Spencer suggested himself. A little bit of Dick Cheney in him there. But by 2010, that was fair game, I guess. At the time, leading such an explicitly racist organization carried great risks for someone with political ambitions. I felt he was too accomplished and had too bright a career in the offing to accept a position that would forever brand him with the mark of Cain, Regnery said. I remember spending time gently trying to talk him out of the idea. But he took the job, and in a speech last year, Regnery said that putting Spencer in charge of NPI secured my place in history. Indeed, Spencer got the group off to an energetic start. He set up a website called AlternativeRight.com and launched Radix Journal, R-A-D-I-X Journal, radixjournal.com, where authors have recently argued that this planet, mankind, and European man would all be better off with less and better humans. More and better Democrats, less and better humans. And pondered whether the reboot of Gilmore Girls depicts the death of white America. That is just a dumb thing to spend any time pondering. You guys are just, that's white nationalist navel gazing, I guess. Within a year, NPI held a press conference at the National Press Club on the subject of the majority strategy, why the GOP, interesting they would choose the GOP, why the GOP must win white America for victory in 2012. Regnery said he can't remember how much money he's contributed to the movement, and there is no way for others to track all his personal donations to political groups, but those that he made through family charities and other tax-exempt organizations, which should lose their tax exemptions for having made those donations, but that's another story. So one's donations from other tax-exempt organizations that he controls or influences total $580,000 since 2001. That's a pittance next to the philanthropists Regnery has compared himself to. The Koch brothers were able to pledge $889 million to candidates for the 2016 election from their own money and other donors, and Greenpeace has said the Kochs spent $100 million between 1997 and 2015 on groups that deny climate change. Meanwhile, Soros has given away about $14 billion to his philanthropic efforts over the past 3 decades through his constellation of international foundations. But in the small pond of white nationalists, $585,000 is a ton of money to be spending on these efforts, said Heidi Beirich, remember her, from the Southern Poverty Law Center, an Alabama-based civil rights group that tracks hate groups and other extremists. You know who they are. She must have come up in yesterday's reading. I recognize the name and remember mangling it. The organization has drawn the ire of the far right and even mainstream academics because of concerns that its characterization of hate groups can sometimes be unfair and capricious. I think they're being borne out more and more these days, though. The amount of money Regnery has given is far and away ahead of anyone else, at least with respect to the alt-right. Next section here, his white nationalist efforts fail. Oh, I can't believe it. Regnery seemed surprised that until the rise of Trump, he was repeatedly rebuffed or ridiculed for his racist views. Take his 2004 suggestion for a white dating site, which he said was inspired by JDate, a Jewish dating service, but which was lambasted in the press. It was recently replaced, of course, with FarmersOnly.com, except they actually went out of their way to put an interracial dating commercial on the air, probably not with anything to do with Regnery, of course, but I would say it's a pretty good bet that FarmersOnly.com is largely white, but the farming community isn't necessarily as white as all that. Oh well. Anyway, they did. To their credit, they said you don't have to be a farmer, you just have to be a country person. And, whatever. I'm not going to fight with FarmersOnly.com. I genuinely enjoy the fact that they exist. All right. His cousin, Alfred Regnery, rolled his eyes when he recalled it and said Bill Regnery was a source of embarrassment for the family. They are super conservative. Don't get me wrong. Anyway, he said his father, Henry, the conservative publishing giant, would just dismiss what Bill would say without any comment. He would have said this is complete nonsense and it's not even worth talking about. In 2006, Regnery was ignominiously voted off the board of ISI, the Conservative Student Association he and his family had been affiliated with for decades. It's hard enough in this world without having a board member who is obviously racist, said Alfred, who abstained from the vote. He blames me, Alfred added. I don't think I've talked to him since then. When that episode came up during the interview in Boca Grande, Regnery began clicking his pen open and shut rapidly. Nervous, angry tick, I guess. He had been part of ISI for decades, he said, and had never discussed the issue with his cousin Alfred. One of NPI's major efforts has been to produce academic-sounding documents. In 2007, it produced a report called The State of White America. The past 53 years have not been kind to white America, the report begins, and as white America goes, so goes America. Well, yeah, because it's kind of run by white people. But anyway, it offers white supremacy as the way to help poor people of color. That's so nice of them. It will only be via reassertion of white prerogatives that the social order, which once helped so many blacks and Hispanics to overcome their communities, and they put that in scare quote, communities, and once redeemed those communities from their baser instincts, that black and Hispanic Americans will be able to enjoy the fruits of American civilization. And if they do, we'll beat them up, kill them, and take those fruits. Because we love fruit, really. It's all about vegetarianism, really. Who knew there were so many white supremacist vegans? To Regnery's frustration, these pronouncements, as authoritative as they might sound, had little apparent impact. NPI kept publishing articles, but the mainstream media rarely, if ever, picked them up, and America wasn't getting any closer to mandated ethno-states. A final insult came when Spencer and Regnery, through the National Policy Institute, tried to arrange a right-wing conference in Hungary. Was Gorka there? In October of 2014. Soon after stepping off the British Airways plane, Regnery was detained by Hungarian immigration officials. "We were accused of being Nazis," he said. It was a rude awakening for the 73-year-old multimillionaire, accustomed as he was to living in luxury. He was held overnight in a detention area like a common immigrant. Oh, so sad. That must have been rough on you. Well, I like that response. Next up, history catches up. Ready? Trump's entry into the Republican presidential primary in June of 2015 began with a speech audaciously promising to end Islamist terrorism and decrying illegal immigration. Trump said that Mexican immigrants were bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Trump's call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States and his proposal to build a wall to deter Latino immigrants appealed to the organizations Regnery had been funding and to a broader audience of white people unsettled by America's changing demographics and by the first black president, by the way. White nationalists such as Taylor made robocalls for Trump before the Iowa caucuses. "We don't need Muslims," Taylor said in a recorded message. "We need smart, well-educated white people who will assimilate to our culture." Yow. Despite the significant media attention the message attracted, neither Trump nor his campaign did anything to repudiate it. Spencer offered his enthusiastic support for Trump in a video released the day after Trump won the New Hampshire primary. "Trump's an important phenomenon because he expressed a kind of nationalism," he said. He called Trump an icebreaker in bringing forth this kind of nationalism. And he's not wrong, trademark. As for Regnery, Trump inspired him to cast the ballot for the first time in half a century. "I tell people I voted twice for president," Regnery said. "Oh, you're under arrest. That's funny. The first time for Barry Goldwater." "Oh, I see. And the second time for Donald Trump." It's a pretty good grandpa joke there, Grandpa. Since the election, the alt-right has fractured, with many popular figures in the pro-Trump internet, such as Mike Cernovich, disowning the label because of its white nationalist connotations. But the racist movement that grew from Spencer's and Regnery's efforts continues to wield considerable influence in American culture. "It's hard to imagine the last political cycle without the alt-right there," Byrick said. "It provided a constituency for Trump, and Trump paid them back in kind. Now, some of their ideas are becoming policy, and some of their leaders now hold important public positions, most notably Steve Bannon, who no longer holds it, but, I'm sure he's still got Trump's ear. And who, of course, he used to run Breitbart News and now is back there, which was described as the platform for the alt-right. Spencer, too, has emerged as a powerful figure on the national stage. To take just one measure, since Election Day, he has been profiled extensively by former classmates in The Atlantic and The Point magazines, by The Washington Post and The Huffington Post, by The Los Angeles Times and The Daily Telegraph of London. He has essentially given Regnery's movement of aging malcontents a fresh face to punch. Whoops, Did I say that? New York Magazine even took care to note how often his media profiles have fixated on his fastidious fashion choices. Remember, he was the dapper guy. Then he got punched in the face, and it stopped. That's weird. After the election, he created a scandal during an NPI conference by making what appeared to be a Nazi salute and calling out, "Hail Trump." At the time, Trump told the New York Times, "I don't want to energize the group, and I disavow the group." But some observers still see a connection. Really? Chin stroking. At least on the level of political philosophy. I would say that Trump's vision of America has been narrowed to focus on and to reflect the ideas of Bannon and Regnery, said Chip Burley, a journalist and historian of extreme right-wing movements in the United States. MacDonald, the Occidental Quarterly publisher who churns out academic-sounding tracts, says the credit all goes back to Regnery, without whom there would have been no Charles Martel Society, no Occidental Quarterly, and no Washington Summit Publishers, a publishing house run by Spencer that specializes in white nationalist and far-right books. And there would not have been a National Policy Institute, the institutional home of the alt-right. Of course not, Spencer agrees. Without these organizations, the alt-right as we know it might never have come into being, and the radicalized politics it broadcasts might never have found such a powerful megaphone. Regnery himself is understated in describing his role in the birth of a movement. I wouldn't say proud, but it's an expression of attitude that has blossomed in the last 10, 12 years. He says, I had a hand in it. Asked if that expression of attitude has been destructive, he thinks, then replies, yeah, but destructive, you know how it is. Creative destruction. I remember hearing that phrase. Well, this is a pretty good time then, having reached the end of the article, to take our break for the first of our station ID pauses. This one coming up right after this. Welcome back again to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Thanks for waiting with us through our first of our station identification breaks. We just finished up reading the article about Bill Regnery, who we began with yesterday. One of the rare carryovers in our show, but I felt it was an interesting place to start, and some good information there about just how they got started and where the money came from, because you wonder about those things. We know all about wingnut welfare. We can't always put a finger on exactly what the source is, and we to this date we've always thought that it was the Koch brothers, but it has become clear that at least in the initial rise in in the mainstream media, our notice that we've taken of the alt-right, there was still a rift between them and the Koch brothers, and I think it maybe even still persists, although I don't know how serious it really is. Interesting to find out that it was Regnery that provided a lot of the initial seed money, and it didn't take a lot. That's one of the more fascinating things. So why did this stuff grow? We have our theories. And on this show, one of our pet theories is that one of the reasons that the alt-right and the Trump worlds intersect so obviously in the Venn diagram of life is that both can largely be described as I've always said, sex cults. Now, not everybody really believes that, but I do, and it's important to describe why, and I sometimes am at a loss for exactly how to do that. So I wanted to pick up this piece in Vox. There's a Vox explainer about why they're a sex cult. They don't come to the same conclusion exactly, but they provide a lot of the same basis for my thinking. How the alt-right's sexism lures men into white supremacy. It'd be important to find out about that. Aja Romano is the writer here. The movement's many online communities prey on male insecurity to advance a racist political agenda. That's our subheader. Let's find out exactly what the hell's going on here. In the wake of the election, perhaps no topic has been more widely discussed and debated than the self-described alt-right, the racist, sexist, meme-happy, mostly internet-based movement associated with radical white supremacy that has unexpectedly taken center stage in U.S. politics after the election of Donald Trump. Though many consider the alt-right to be primarily a fringe movement encompassing multiple ideologies, including white nationalism and white supremacy, its supporters' unorthodox tactics for promoting those ideologies were fundamental to Trump's campaign and thus fundamental to his victory. Said tactics included engaging in extremist discourse, using deceptive irony and racially tinged internet memes to confuse people into dismissing the alt-right label as a synonym for internet trolls, as I initially did, I think, and spreading false and misleading information. I think now those are simply chief characteristics of people who describe themselves as alt-right. Thus, the article continues, it's no surprise that the movement has become a focal point of the subsequent culture war and narratives surrounding the president-elect's transition to the White House, particularly outrage that Trump arguably won through racist rhetoric and that his chief strategist is directly associated with the alt-right movement. And I think that's something he says about himself all the time. Now, it strikes me as I'm reading this, why does this sounds sort of outdated, or at least old in some sense. And it is. It made me scroll back up to the top and say, what's the date on this piece? December 14th, 2016. So it does seem a little bit dated, but it's interesting because this is about when we started to ponder what was this alt-right stuff really all about. Anyway, I don't know, we may have done it a little bit before the election, but seems like we only got serious about it afterwards because we realized, oh my God, this idiot's going to be president. We better figure out what's going on here. So where were we with this one? Yes. One foundational aspect of the alt-right's various belief systems has been significantly downplayed following the election, even though it may be the key to understanding the movement's racist, I want to mix that with fascist, racist white nationalist agenda. While it's true that the movement is most frequently described in terms of the self-stated explicit white supremacy that defines many of its corners, for many of its members, the gateway drug that led them to join the alt-right in the first place wasn't racist rhetoric, but rather sexism, extreme misogyny evolving from male bonding gone haywire. The alt-right label, it says here, is tricky to define, but the movement's top priority is elevating the status of white men. Don't let the term alt-right fool you, despite the fact that it's the self-chosen descriptor adopted by many white supremacists. The ideology under the hood is still the same. Not only do members of the alt-right support the most extreme version of Trump's campaign promises to deport millions of immigrants and create a national registry for Muslims, but their ultimate goal is to ethnically cleanse non-white individuals from America and establish a completely white ethno-state. Members of the alt-right tend to be young white men spouting blatantly racist, nationalist, and misogynistic views that align eerily well with historical fascism, and many of these men openly advocate harassment and discrimination, or worse, of women and minority groups, or worse, of course, rape and murder, but we all know what they're talking about here. Indeed, since the election, overt tension surrounding these various spheres has led to hundreds of reported hate crimes. Consequently, many people have pondered whether the alt-right label puts too fine a polish on what is, at best, an ugly mix of racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. This is, of course, evocative of the early discussion and debates about the alt-right and what to call them. In response, many news organizations have grappled with whether it's appropriate to use the term at all, and if so, how to define it for their readers. That struggle is mostly over, and I think Charlottesville put it finally to death, and it's now much more in fashion to come straight out in the newsrooms of America and say, look, they're white nationalists and sometimes just straight up Nazis, and we can say so. But no matter what you call it, the movement is plainly built around a political agenda that seeks to advance the rights of white male citizens at the expense of everybody else, literally everybody else, including white females. And they shouldn't forget it. The alt-right's indoctrination process starts out looking like a healthy way for men to socialize. That's certainly the attempt at logic that pervades it. In a widely shared Twitter thread the morning after the election, the writer Siyanda Mohutsiwa, as my best guess at the pronunciation, Siyanda Mohutsiwa, outlined what she views as the insidious process by which young men are radicalized into the alt-right. It may have been that we read some of this at the time. The tweet storm begins this way. If people followed the alt-right groups on Reddit, they would know that young white Americans were told to hide their support of Trump. These college-educated young men were then ripe enough to be sold the idea that Trump represented a return to men being real men. Many of these radical white men were raised by single feminist mothers. Internet groups radicalized their sexual frustration into bigotry. These online groups found young white men at their most vulnerable and convinced them liberals were colluding to destroy white Western manhood. When we talk about online radicalization, we always talk about Muslims, but the radicalization of white men online is at astronomical levels. Mohutsua's tweet storm elucidates an important, generally overlooked point. Most white men who become radicalized into the alt-right start out in search of some like-minded friends. Any friends. Please, God, any friends will do. Though various branches of the movement are often at odds with one another, they share a number of core beliefs and a common meme-flavored vernacular that serve to unite them in what is sometimes called the manosphere. This realm includes the men's rights movement, pickup artist culture, a community of men, also labeled PUAs, pickup artists, that essentially makes a game of the art of bedding women. Incels, that is, men who are involuntarily celibate because they feel women reject them, and geek gatekeepers like supporters of the Gamergate movement. That does overlap quite a bit, I would think, with the incels. Those used to be known as nerds, geeks, losers, or weirdo virgins, etc., which is very unkind and obviously will drive them absolutely insane. And they, I guess I can sympathize that they want to try and find some support after all that. I mean, there's a lot of bullying that went on, I think, in the formation of these guys. And I think once they found one another and found what they felt like was their support group and that gave them power and influence, or at least the appearance of power and influence in the media, with the media, whatever. Well, you know, I think then at that point they felt like it was their obligation as manly men to reject the notion of any of that bullying having had any impact on them at all. And that bullying really, it's interesting because, I mean, it's what set them off on this path. And I guess if they feel like they're in the right place now, then they're not worried or upset about bullying, and they think that anti-bullying programs are part of the whole wimpification, or they like, of course, to use the term pussification, which I guess we can even do on the air now because the president, well, we won't even bother going down that path again. But they reject all of that. Participation trophies and anti-bullying and yada, yada. And meanwhile, we could have done so much better if we had had these programs in place earlier. Anyway, on the surface, get back to the article here. On the surface, PUA communities and incel communities have a lot of generic appeal. The PUA lifestyle emphasizes self-esteem and confidence building along with physical health, while the incel community allows men to bond over their struggle to achieve all of the above in spite of their sour luck with women. Meanwhile, gee whiz, and you know, it all feeds on itself, of course. Why don't women like men who treat them like crap and et cetera, et cetera? Well, you know, some do, and that's all the kernel of truth that they need to continue thinking that all women deep down actually do like that. Meanwhile, gamers and geeks habitually tout the importance of gaming in providing social interaction for young men. These spaces foster the kind of male friendship whose importance doesn't get a lot of attention in the real world, but the benefits of their existence are often accompanied and sometimes negated by their tendency to instill in their members a newfound articulation of fundamental anxiety over their position as men in a society where women are actively seeking empowerment. And in building its membership from so many different communities of white men who ultimately feel threatened and rejected by women, the movement promotes a sense of male entitlement that is easily radicalized into white nationalism and white supremacy. How sexism serves as the alt-right's gateway drug is next. In many alt-right communities, men are encouraged to view women as sexual and or political targets that men must dominate. The men in these communities don't see themselves as sexist. They see themselves as fighting against their own emasculation and sexual repression at the hands of strident feminists. For instance, one alt-right blog described the activist group Code Pink as a sort of liberal feminist version of the Westboro Baptist Church. Interesting. All of these individual communities advocate a distrust of feminism and an insistence that female empowerment necessarily disempowers men. One of the most famous, Reddit's r/the red pill, even paints this ideology as a religious conversion, an awakening, or taking the red pill, a reference borrowed from The Matrix, to understand what they regard as the life-altering, quote, truth that feminism has ruined modern society for everyone, but especially for men. Many people who've tried engaging with the red pill group only to walk away, have described it as a place where relationships are viewed primarily in terms of power struggles rather than mutual respect and equality. In practice, one Reddit user wrote, their ideas became pretty toxic really fast. Reddit RZRTV Redditor, RZRTV, experienced this firsthand. He found his way into the red pill after witnessing his father's painful experience in court during a messy divorce. He told Vox that despite being socially progressive for most of his life, he had been drawn to the movement's anti-feminist message, feeling resentment for the way feminism seemed to be blaming white men for everything. I was grateful for the community to be raising points that affected my father and my life, he told Vox, noting that Reddit's various men's rights forums were full of great points about how society expects men to be emotionally reserved. They also provided a basic form of support in acknowledging that men are allowed to be emotional, flawed humans, which he found to be a big selling point. Of course, many feminists frequently point out that gender stereotypes about men are unfair, harmful, and need dismantling, but feminists and men's rights activists, commonly referred to as MRAs, rarely listen to each other. Neither side seems to accurately assess its tribalism, he said. Both sides. RZRTV spent nearly 2 years in the community, but gradually soured on its message due to the overwhelming hatred, which got to the point where everything seemed to be about taking down women or minorities rather than helping men in the areas they faced discrimination, he said. The tipping point where I was finally fed up is memorable. There was an article posted to r/men's rights with the title, Hillary Clinton will be worse for men than Donald Trump will be for women, which I knew was complete BS. The blatant BS, and again, it's not BS here, but I have to say BS. The blatant BS allowed to propagate in the community had finally reached a boiling point, and I stopped putting effort into the same causes. It's important to note that while sexism and bigotry ultimately drove RZRTV away from Reddit's men's rights communities, he said he never sought out a great deal of emotional support from them to begin with, as I'm a pretty private person and I don't seek that type of thing out. But other men who do lean on these communities for emotional support may be prone to falling further into the hate-filled environment. Mohutsua argued in her tweet storm that we have been paying the wrong kind of attention to the alt-right's internet havens. When we talk about online radicalization, we always talk about Muslims, but the radicalization of white men online is at astronomical levels, she wrote. That's why I never got one strategy of Clinton's campaign, highlighting Trump's sexism. Trump supporters love him because of his sexism. That's true, but we were supposed to drive other people crazy with the realization that he was an idiot. The alt-right's vernacular is full of sexist language. Weak moderates or liberals who buy into the feminist agenda are deemed cucks, a term derived, as you know, from cuckold, the arcane Old English word for a man whose wife cheats on him. Many of the movement's various sub-communities have insisted that the word is, warning, the following 2 links, we obviously won't click on the links, but in case you do later on, contain hate speech, these 2 links do. But many of the movement's various sub-communities have insisted that the word is strictly racist and that its origins center on white men being disempowered by miscegenation and other forms of interaction with members of the other races. But in its practical use by the alt-right at large, most frequently to harass women online, the common implication is that progressive men are sexually disempowered by manipulative women. This ideology inevitably has political ramifications. On PUA forums, where men proudly talk about their lay counts, the default assumption in the days leading up to the election was that a vote for Hillary Clinton signified weakness that no real man would display. Witness this exchange that took place on one PUA forum the morning after the election. Joe91 wrote, "I wonder if a vote for Trump means a rejection of SJWs, social justice warriors, and third wave feminism and extreme leftism in general, and a vote for Hillary means the opposite. Doubt it's that simple, though. If it is, we're screwed because half the country would be an extremist leftist SJW feminist cuck." Whatever that's supposed to mean. And someone commented on that. "My thoughts exactly, and only one of the reasons I voted for him. Hopefully this pegs women down a bit as they were getting a bit too full of themselves / out of hand." Really. The basic idea that, quote, women are getting too out of hand is the patriarchal common denominator, and it aligns perfectly with male rage against social justice activism, which in turn paves the way for white nationalism and white supremacy to gain a foothold. The alt-right's ongoing fight against social justice warriors fuels a larger campaign of white supremacy. That's our next section. And it kicks off with another of Sayanda Mohutsua's tweets here. "These online groups found young white men at their most vulnerable and convinced them liberals were colluding to destroy white Western manhood. Over the past few years, Gamergate and male-centric Reddit communities have popularized the idea of social justice warriors, commonly abbreviated as SJWs. This disparaging label is an updated way to accuse progressives of extreme political correctness. The SJW label is a huge and successful weapon in the alt-right's arsenal. It paints feminists as manipulative, oversensitive, shrill women who attack men with claims of sexism at the tiniest of provocations while rejecting their sexual advances. Men who deploy the SJW attack seek to reestablish control and agency over the cultural conversation by ridiculing progressive attempts to seek greater diversity and representation in media and to dismiss basically anything that could be deemed multiculturalism or representation. See Gamergate and this year's Ghostbusters backlash. That would, of course, be last year's. However, nested within the alt-right's fight against SJWs is a flagrantly radical white supremacist element. Members of the alt-right frequently refer to progressive culture as cultural Marxism, a favored catchphrase of Breitbart founder Andrew Breitbart. The academic term cultural Marxism is a positive one that denotes the spread of Marxist values throughout culture, but its common use today is much more pejorative. Members of the alt-right view SJWs, who are actively trying to make art and culture more inclusive, as attempting to incite socio-cultural and socio-economic upheaval under the guise of diversity. In fact, the term cultural Marxism is descended from actual Nazi propaganda, a distrust of modernism and the spread of non-Germanic culture that Hitler called cultural Bolshevism. In his book, A History of Nazi Germany, 1919 to 1945, historian Joseph W. Bendersky notes that the phrase was code for the cultural purging that preceded the Holocaust. Hitler referred to cultural Bolshevism as a disease that would weaken the Germans and leave them prey to the Jews, Bendersky writes. A moral struggle was underway, and the outcome could determine the survival of the race. The updated alt-right version of this idea primarily targets feminists and progressives as the instigators of this cultural demise. Their belief in insidious cultural plots against white patriarchy leads them to overlap and interact with another branch of the alt-right, the innumerable online right-wing conspiracy groups that see Jewish, Islamic, and foreign plots in perceived attacks on white patriarchal culture. The all-or-nothing urgency and the blatant nationalism of white supremacy of Hitler's version of the phrase is still intact. And it embeds here a couple of, alt-right tweets here. Let's see. There was Truthophobes who tweeted along with this meme that says Brexit victory was a punch in the guts to the left. Trump victory is a knockout uppercut to the jaw. The left has been knocked to the canvas as the West fights back against cultural Marxism and Islam, Truthophobes group. That's labeled there. And Truthophobes says here of that meme, the Trump victory marks an important moment in history, capital H. It was the day good people stood up and defeated evil. Cultural Marxism has been smashed. And then this, alleged woman, and I say that advisedly because it looks more like perhaps a Russian troll than anything else, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Regressive left has climaxed with Trump and Milo effect, and 20 years of conditioning of cultural Marxism will soon be laid to rest. Allegedly from one Christina Davich, I'm guessing is the pronunciation here, who tweets as Moonchild Wanderer, but makes me think it's actually a Russian bot. In essence, many men who were drawn to these communities because they wanted to get laid and gain self-confidence have found themselves embroiled in a culture war, one that started as a way to boost individual male autonomy and evolved into a way to wrest back control of the country, nay, the world, from shrill feminists and their weakling cuck supporters, which include libtard shills in the mainstream media. And Sianda chiming in here with her tweet that said, young men came to these online groups for tips on picking up girls and came out believing that it was up to them to save Western civilization. And who wouldn't want to be told that? Your quest to get laid is really a quest. It's not all that stupid and selfish after all. It's really a quest to restore Western civilization. Wouldn't you rather think that you were saving Western civilization than pathetically trying to get laid and losing every time? Probably. Of course this is difficult. I'm trying to save Western civilization versus, of course I can't pick up these girls. I'm not good at it and I'm socially awkward and I'm having a hard time of it. That's harder to admit than, say, failing because you're trying to save Western civilization. That's a huge task. Of course I'm failing at that. I'll try again because it's super important and it's totally not a distraction and a selfish waste of time like trying to get laid, which, hey, I mean, that's nice too, but whatever. Ultimately, these groups found their hero in Donald Trump. And here is an embedded Reddit conversation, which I don't really think we really have to go through, but suffice to say, they're all very excited about Trump's election and overstate the situation, let's say. So next up, the next section here, Gamergate foreshadowed the alt-right's rise, we've heard that before, and created an unsettling template for the movement to expand. In the wake of Trump's victory, many have pointed to Gamergate's sexist assault on feminism as a harbinger of things to come. Far more than the fringe components of the alt-right, the Gamergate movement drew mainstream attention from its beginnings in August of 2014 and gained extensive coverage from popular geek media outlets as well as international news organizations as it grew. Though it peaked around the spring of 2015, the movement is still active. Writing at The Guardian, Matt Lees points out that its supporters' techniques of harassment and rhetorical victim blaming have become the standard toolset of far-right voices online. Writers who've reported on and or been targeted by Gamergate have also noted the convergence of the group's membership with that of the alt-right. David Futrell is a journalist who has spent the past 5 years maintaining a men's rights watch blog, We Hunted the Mammoth. In an email to Vox, he said that it's close to impossible to overstate the role of Gamergate in the process of alt-right radicalization. From the start, Gamergate was based on the same sense of aggrieved entitlement that drives the alt-right and many Trump voters. While Trump warned of the putative dangers of Muslims and Mexicans invading America, Gamergaters talked about the dangers of so-called social justice warriors invading the world of gaming. Many defined gaming as a male space or even a male safe space. And so it was no coincidence that they focused so much of their anger at supposed female interlopers, including gaming cultural critics like Anita Sarkeesian, Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, and others. By presenting themselves as beleaguered defenders of gaming's safe space, Gamergaters managed to convince themselves that their harassment of people like Sarkeesian and Quinn was in fact a defense of an imperiled culture. They were saving the world. And it strikes me as I'm reading this how similar the thinking was to lost causers and ex-Confederates. They simply thought the same thing. They were just sure of it. But they wanted to put a different face on it. And so did some of these guys. One of the feminist targets of Gamergate was gaming journalist Lee Alexander, who recently wrote about the movement's expansion and convergence with the alt-right movement. When I was harassed in an attempt to get me to abandon progressive critical stances on the relationship between pop culture and politics, is what she was talking about, during the embarrassment that was Gamergate, everyone told me it was just a radar blip, she wrote. They said that the hit pieces on Breitbart about me, other women, and progressive voices in technology were just fringe issues. We should not give them any more attention, everyone said. They couldn't have been more wrong. Don't punch Nazis. Or whatever. Now the CEO of Breitbart, Steve Bannon, is an advisor to incoming President Trump. And in the last few weeks, all of these same old people, the dross of image board culture with their same assembly line right-wing memes, are back in my Twitter timeline letting me know they won. These people's fears, their power fantasies, are now steering the world. Well, good point there. And I don't know whether it's fair to take away that maybe you should punch Nazis, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'll reconsider, though, perhaps after this short break. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show. We are back from our second break. Let me take care of our music here. Thanks for waiting for us to get to the other side here. We're in the second hour of today's show. And we left off just after reading the excerpt from, which writer was it we were talking about here? I'm going to have to scroll back up. Lee Alexander, making the very interesting point that, when she was advised that Gamergate was just a radar blip and would all go away at some point, there was no way of knowing, perhaps, that they would morph into or join with the alt-right and become, well, for all intents and purposes, considered a legitimate political power. I hope we're reassessing that as we speak. And, it was a little bit broad to say that we ought to conclude from this that the answer is punching Nazis. She doesn't say so and doesn't imply as much, and we shouldn't take that away, although, once again, sometimes that actually works. It depends on the person, the situation, and the Nazi involved, and it shouldn't surprise you that your results may vary. But no, she doesn't explicitly say that this is the case, but she does insist that ignore them and they'll go away doesn't seem to be working very well either. Futrell pointed out to Vox that Gamergate's explicit sexism led many of its members to 4chan, and to 4chan's even more extreme sibling 8chan, which became a haven for Gamergate after the movement was officially booted off 4chan for misogyny. I didn't even realize how that happened. In those enclaves, Futrell says, there were hordes of neo-quasi-Nazis, some ironic Nazis, but many others utterly sincere, ready to tell them that it wasn't just gaming that needed saving, but Western civilization itself. He continued, they weren't fighting for the right to look at boobs in video games anymore, but fighting against white genocide. Suddenly, the weirdly inflated, often melodramatic rhetoric of Gamergate made more sense. Gamergate-inspired violence also presaged the wave of hate crimes that have been reported since the election. Examples of the past, from the past 2 years include the threat of a mass shooting at a major public university because the university hosted Gamergate enemy Anita Sarkeesian, the many pro-rape statements made on PUA hubs and social media accounts by prominent pickup artists like the notorious internet troll Roosh V. I don't know whether that's Roosh the Fifth or what, but maybe it's just V, who bragged about committing rape. And finally, the 2014 mass stabbing and shooting of 6 UC Santa Barbara students by Elliot Rodger, a man who fortified his misogyny and sense of alienation via the incel communities he frequented online. In light of the misogyny that seems permanently embedded within alt-right culture, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that the movement's favored presidential candidate also once bragged about sexually assaulting women. Trump may not fit the pattern of online activity that leads so many men to the alt-right fold, but he has planted himself within an online alt-right echo chamber. His ideas are informed by and emboldening to a growing collective of men who view the subordination of women as both part of a functional society and a stepping stone to a larger movement, one steeped in fascist ideology and willing to openly champion hate as a political cause. The ease with which the alt-right channels male insecurity around women's rights into an ideology of white supremacy ultimately illustrates that the paths by which men wander into the alt-right movement are deceptive. While many of the movement's male-centered online communities may seem to offer something of value to the men who join them, the alt-right movement has never been about helping men cope with low self-esteem, relationship problems, or their personal pain and insecurity. In fact, it's never particularly concerned itself with the building up of men as individuals at all. Instead, it's about maintaining a sense of power at all costs over an ever-expanding list of designated targets. And with Trump's victory, the movement now has more power than ever. Well, that's pretty insightful, I thought, and I think some of it we already knew, some of it we've discussed before, some of it we danced around. A good reminder, and I'm glad it was on hand. Now, it makes me think of another article along the way that I don't know if we ever got around to discussing it, and I may have to sort of take a pause and see, but I have so many other pieces that I want to get to. Maybe I'll just make a note to self and move on to this other piece here concerning some of the individuals who have seen their stars rise under the banner of the alt-right, and in particular rise and fall in and around the Charlottesville events. One such name that sort of came out of nowhere. We all sort of watched the very brief rise and fall of Richard Spencer. But what about Chris Cantwell, a name that probably entered your consciousness only at or around the Charlottesville events? Maybe you were unfortunate enough to catch wind of him earlier. The Chicago Tribune has this piece, The Rise and Humiliating Fall of Chris Cantwell, Charlottesville's Starring Fascist. Avi Selk actually wrote this for the Washington Post. For some reason, I've picked it up from the Chicago Tribune, but a little variety never hurt anyone. This is August 18th of this year. The white supremacists, nationalists, and far-right trolls who starred in last weekend's violent Charlottesville, Virginia rallies have suffered no lack of humiliation in the days since. Take Millennial Matt, whose catchphrase, "Hitler did nothing wrong," earned him tens of thousands of fans before he went to the rally, but his Twitter account has since been deleted, his real identity publicized, and he's now begging fans for money to flee his hometown because, quote, "my life is in shambles." As frequently happens under Nazi regimes, what can you do? It's tough luck, I guess. That's too bad, as Trump might have said. There are plenty of other examples, from the hot dog restaurant cook who lost his job to students whose universities publicly renounced racism after they went to the march. No, the restaurant cook didn't lose his job to those students. That's the way I just made it sound, but you remember the libertarian hot dog guy. That one really cracked me up. Anyway, also some students everywhere who were being identified are finding themselves, gee whiz, in trouble for being Nazis. There's even a Twitter feed devoted to shaming the tiki torch-lit faces of white nationalism. But none of the marchers soared so high or crashed so hard as Chris Cantwell, who became the ivory-skinned, gun-toting star of a documentary about Charlottesville that aired last Monday on HBO, and a week later is better known as the weepy white supremacist, or weeping Nazi, who got banned from OkCupid. By the time I figured out who this guy was, it was all over. But and I wondered, who is this guy? Why is he the featured individual in this thing? I don't know. I missed the rise, but I caught part of the fall. Act 1, it says here, Hail Cantwell. For a few triumphant hours, Cantwell was the thick-armed embodiment of white nationalism to tens of millions of people, the star of Vice News's and HBO's web documentary about last weekend's rallies, which has been seen by more than 30 million times. He looked every bit the rebel leader in that footage from Friday night and Saturday, greeting other white nationalists from as far away as Canada, marching by torchlight to the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, screaming, "Jews will not replace us." "I carry a pistol. I go to the gym all the time," Cantwell tells the camera, muscles bulging beneath a shirt that advertises his blog, which in turn advertises Cantwell as a libertarian fascist, as if there were such a thing. "I'm trying to make myself more capable of violence," he says. And violence there was. Men in the streets of Charlottesville wielding Confederate flags like spears. A black man beaten by white men with sticks. Heather Heyer killed when a car rammed a crowd of counter-protesters as 19 others were injured. Cantwell got his licks too, as seen in the documentary. "Communists," he yells, pouring a jug of milk over his eyes after, he says, counter-protesters hit him with tear gas. "Second time in 2 effing days. They're afraid of you. You got too big," an admirer tells him. "Hail Cantwell," cries another. And then the self-avowed fascist was back on his feet and leading a march, shirtless, a few cans short of a six-pack gleaming in the weekend sun. "We'll effing kill these people if we have to," Cantwell says. An interesting Act 1. And here comes Act 2, Cantwell the Coward. Cantwell's bravado only increased over the weekend as news of the violence spread across the country. He invited the Vice reporter to his hotel room after the marches, where he showed off his high-powered rifles and the 9mm pistol strapped to his ankle. The fatal car strike was justified, Cantwell insisted. The protesters had been, quote, "stupid animals." "Someone died," the reporter reminded him. "I think a lot more people are going to die before we're finally done, frankly," Cantwell said. End film. Tens of millions of people have since watched it, and Cantwell would freshen his Facebook profile with photos of himself in the thick of the violence. But as the weekend faded, other footage began to circulate. Cantwell had apparently recorded it during the rally in what appeared to be the privacy of a hotel room. And the famed white separatist appeared to be at the point of tears. "I've been told there's a warrant out for my arrest," Cantwell pleads to the camera, through sniffles and a trembling voice. "I don't know what to do. How did this happen? Who is it? Where did this guy come from?" There were, in fact, felony warrants out for him, the Boston Globe would later report, for the use of illegal gas and injury by chemical or explosive. University of Virginia didn't immediately respond to the request for comment from the Washington Post. In his confessional, Cantwell told the camera he was too scared to go to the courthouse or meet police. He complained that Chelsea Manning had been threatening to curb stomp Nazis. Really? Maybe. I don't know. But you would think that he would be less than willing to be publicly afraid of that. But okay. "I know we talk a lot of S-word on the internet," Cantwell said, "but every step of the way we've tried to do the right thing and they just won't stop. Our enemies just will not stop." It's unclear where the video was first posted, but copies quickly spread across YouTube, mocked on the political left and right alike. "White supremacist cries after realizing he could be arrested," wrote Mother Jones. "Mo master race, ha 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 ha," a user added on 4chan's /Paul message board, which is something of a hotbed of racism itself. And Cantwell's week would only get worse. Act 3, straight, man, single. By midweek, Cantwell's name was as well known in the mainstream media as the fringes of the internet. But who was he really? As the Boston Globe told it, Cantwell was a former comedian from Keene, New Hampshire, who more recently moved to New York. He is described by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an unapologetic fascist who spews white nationalist propaganda with a libertarian spin on his live-streamed call-in show and seeks a whites-only state. See, now, if I had a call-in, I might turn into a libertarian Nazi with a preference for a white-only state. That's why I don't do calls. It's not why I don't do calls. But that's a good enough excuse. You don't want that, do you? You don't want that on your head. Well, who else is this guy? Because there's more to it here. Well, per an OkCupid profile leaked online, he's also a 6-foot-tall single guy interested in getting married and having children with the right woman. I assume, that describes a lot of people. his softer side. Ideally, I'd like to talk on here briefly, more quickly on the phone, and then we can go out on a date and see what happens, wrote the user It's Chris603 beneath what appears to be a Jim Mirror selfie of Cantwell, which Ars Technica reported was his account. He described himself not as a fascist, but as a podcaster specializing in controversial political satire. It's great because I have a very flexible schedule, he wrote. A typical Friday night would find him not, say, screaming about Jews at a white nationalist march, but rather doing date nights, bowling, live shows, movies, travel, all types of things. Nice walk in the sand. I like horses, the whole bit. OkCupid, remarkably, announced in a tweet that Cantwell did have an account and he had just been banned for life. We were alerted that white supremacist Chris Cantwell was on OkCupid. Within 10 minutes, we banned him for life, the tweet said. Tinder booted him too. Cantwell confirmed in a slur-filled blog post Thursday explaining that these Jews will stop at nothing. I had no idea that they were Jews. Likewise, his YouTube channel, Facebook page, and Twitter account have all been deleted as tech companies rush to purge extremists of all kinds from their platforms since Charlottesville. So there it is. The man who was an HBO famous swaggering racist Monday has been reduced by the end of the week to broadcasting from an undisclosed location via a Tumblr account and his personal blog. Cantwell had hired a lawyer, he wrote Thursday, and was preparing to turn himself in to police. Depending on who you listen to, I'm either a hero, a terrorist, or a crybaby, he wrote, which should tell you something about the reliability of the media, except that, of course, all of that was based on videotape of you that you disseminated. I really don't know what to make of this guy. But maybe he's one of those guys that think projecting an image of instability is somehow strategically important. I don't know. He's a weirdo, and he rose and fell inside of a single week as far as I can make out, and I cannot figure out why it happened and whether we're ever going to see this guy again. I mean, I hope we don't, but who even knows? And he's not the only one. How about this other dude, Baked Alaska? Have you heard about him? I had heard his name before Chris Cantwell's, but he too has kind of had a meteoric rise and fall. And I hate using the word meteoric for that, but, who's got this one? Business Insider. Oliver Darcy wrote for Business Insider, The Untold Story of Baked Alaska, a rapper turned BuzzFeed personality. BuzzFeed, you're responsible for this? BuzzFeed personality turned alt-right troll. There's a lot of turning going on. This is from April of this year, and I had no idea. I mean, I figured he was a goofball, but I didn't know how goofy he was. Tim Treadstone Gionet, Gionet, Gionet. I don't know how he would pronounce that, or where the Treadstone comes from, because it's enclosed in quotes here. Tim Treadstone Gionet was not always a supporter of President Donald Trump. The 29-year-old internet troll, most widely known as Baked Alaska, seems to be an unlikely person to wade into the real estate mogul's camp at the start of the 2016 election season. Back then, Gionet identified as a carefree, easygoing libertarian. Isn't it lovely how they all started as libertarians and became authoritarians? He supported Kentucky Senator Rand Paul's bid for the White House, as though he were any kind of libertarian, firmly opposed to the war on drugs, because he liked taking them, and championed the cause of Black Lives Matter. Amazingly enough, how do you like that? Actively participating in the movement's street demonstrations. And he worked at BuzzFeed, hardly an incubator for Trump supporters, but Gionet, no idea. Anybody know? Gionet was the exception. As he put it, BuzzFeed turned me into a monster. Specifically, a monster who opposed what he saw as political correctness gone amok. He found refuge with those who voraciously supported the freewheeling, brash antics of Trump. I'll never forget this story, Gionet said, recalling to Business Insider the aha moment that drove him toward Trump. I was talking about the new Justin Bieber album. What? I don't even know. Okay. Well, why? I was talking about the new Justin Bieber album, and I was like, dude, that new Justin Bieber album is dope. I have to admit, I love Justin Bieber. He is totally my spirit animal. I mean, I don't know what to say, but okay, whatever, whatever floats your boat, I guess. But this is where, look at how this goes. So he says, he's totally my spirit animal. And someone comes up to me. I don't even know if this is really true. This doesn't have the ring of truth to it, but he claims. Someone came up to me and was like, hey, bro, you can't say spirit animal. That's culturally appropriating Native American culture, and that's not cool. I could see somebody coming up with that. I don't know whether I would agree with that necessarily. I think not. That's the sort of thing that would certainly make me roll my eyes, and, I like to consider myself fairly progressive about, okay, I point taken, but not very well, I would say. But this is what drove him off the cliff, I guess. I was like, what? What the F are you talking about? I had heard about the dangers of political correctness, but I thought this was just exaggerated, Janet said. I thought there was no way people in real life could be like this. And I would agree. But also, why not just let that roll off your back and say, I disagree with you? But apparently if it's real, he feels things too deeply. I mean, what can I tell you? He's just a nut. I guess that shouldn't surprise me. Jeanette said the incident and others like it sent him down a path that ultimately led to his resignation from BuzzFeed and eventual transformation into one of the internet's most notorious alt-right trolls. The thing that really attracted me to Trump was his stance against political correctness, he said. No one will ever tell me I'm culturally appropriating again. GNA is something of a Forrest Gump of politics. How so? He surfaced in a number of places in the far-right universe during the 2016 presidential election. Upon leaving BuzzFeed, GNA went on the road as manager for right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos' college tour. He spent Christmas with blogger Chuck Johnson, and he finished the campaign working with New Right personality Mike Cernovich. Although, I don't know, this is very weird, but I guess I've seen this kind of bizarro world transformation before. What was that game? The name of the guy escapes me, and it's like a famous insider meme among Daily Kos editors from years ago. Lee Stranahan is the guy. As a joke, everybody would pretend that Lee, what's his name? When we get his name wrong all the time. But do you remember that guy? And he started out as a very liberal, progressive guy, and he got on the wrong side of something somewhere and got in an argument. I think one of many people who have had arguments with Marcos over the years over God only knows what, but he was so angered by it that he found comfort in his hatred of Marcos, I think, on the right, because of course they hated Marcos, and then they were willing to fund his work. And we have a very serious problem on the left of actually having people's work find funding. And very frequently, if they're that unstable and they find funding available to them from the right, they just go in that direction. I think you all know some examples of it besides Stranahan, and I won't get into that. I'll continue with this article, but it does remind me of that strange phenomenon. It does happen. It doesn't happen the other way very often, but it does happen there too, right? But how do you find the fun? I don't know. Well, I guess you just luck out. Anyway, during this time, his influence in the far-right internet community grew. In addition to forging connections with the right's top internet celebrities, GNA saw accelerated growth of his own Twitter account. He gained thousands of followers, arriving at the approximately 160,000 figure of people who followed him today on the social media platform. GNA also became one of the de facto leaders of the alt-right meme army, using images of characters like Pepe the Frog to bait those in opposition to Trump. And yet, despite the person he projected on the outside, some of those closest to him had reservations about how much he really bought into the politics he now hawks. Many were surprised at how far right he has veered. His politics strained personal and professional relationships. In conversations with friends, family, and former coworkers, an image of a kind but often lonely social media genius emerged. Genius? All right. One who had reinvented himself several times in his life in a desperate quest to fill the void of loneliness with fame and attention, irrespective of the cost. I've seen him happy. I've seen him sad. I've seen him doing well. I've seen him doing bad. It sounds like a rhyme here. But his whole thing is he wants people to like him, so he wants to be famous, said Joe Hood, a former friend and colleague who worked at BuzzFeed Video with Giannette. To me, his conflict now is that it was easier to get famous without people liking him, and now he's famous, but no one likes him. And, well, if you saw him, you could see why that would be the case. I hate to judge a book by its cover, but this is an extraordinarily dumb book. Anyway, so next section, I need a name. I need an industry name to be known by. Giannette, because you don't know how to pronounce it, you could see why you'd want to change it, was born in Anchorage, Alaska, to a family of 8 children, 5 of whom were adopted from Russia. Did you hear me? Adopted from Russia. Dun, dun, dun. I can't believe it. Well, it's true. Very sad, but at any rate, we'll have to move on from there. And I forgot. Yeah, I had the sound effect. I should have gone to that one. I just did it on my own. I did it manually rather than use my digital sound effects. 5 of whom were adopted from Russia. How interesting. His father, Paul, is a pharmacist. A pharmacist? Now I can get that. A pharmacist, you say? Dun, dun, dun. How come that won't go off? No, that's weird. Anyway, here we go. Maybe this button will do it. A Russian pharmacist. I don't know. I forget it. Do I have another one? Oh, yeah, I've got the horror one. A Russian pharmacist. Dun, dun, dun. There we are. Ooh, the minor keys. Well, anyway, there's nothing wrong with being a pharmacist. Or a Russian, for that matter. Anyway, Suzanne, his mother, is a nurse. A nurse? All right, never mind. They are devout Christians. Oh, man, I could play the music again. And raise their children as such. The family also operates a non-profit organization, Russian Encouragement Ministries. This is weird. Which aims to spread the gospel and provide medical supplies to orphanages in eastern Russia, a cause his father, said Giannette, actively participated in during his youth. Tim has come to Russia with us probably 15 times. Wow. Paul said, adding Giannette even speaks a little bit of Russian as a kid, a teenager, and a young adult. Upon graduating high school in 2006, Giannette left Alaska for Los Angeles to attend Azusa Pacific University. Okay, to study film and marketing. During his time there, he said he scored a position at Warner Brothers Records where he was spotted by Kevin Lyman, the founder of Warped Tour. He offered him a job. How do we get spotted at a thing? I never get spotted in my jobs. Where I go. Oh, you're here. I can see that you're here, but nobody ever spots me and says, you know what? I want to give you a different job. I'm going to promote you. Well, too bad. Maybe it's social justice warriors conspiring against me. I'm joining the Scientologist / alt-right. Anyway, he was a nice guy, and I said, why don't you come and work for me for a bit, Lyman said. He wasn't baked Alaska at that point. In fact, it was Lyman who helped give Giannette his now famous or infamous moniker. He's like, you're in the entertainment business. You need to have a name. All anyone cared about is you're from Alaska, so your name is Alaska. That's very creative. Your name is Alaska, Giannette said. I was like, okay. He was like, trust me, you're from Alaska. That is all anyone is going to want to ask you about. That's your name. He's like, you need a name. No one cares about Tim. They care about Alaska. Okay, goddammit, I get the point, Tim. How many times are you going to say it? I was like, damn it, this guy is a genius. He named me Alaska because I'm from Alaska. How genius is he? The guy is right. I need a name. I need an industry name to be known by. So my name was Alaska. After a while, I realized just being called Alaska worked, but I needed to differentiate myself because I guess there are other people from Alaska. That music means we have to take a short break for station identification. We will be back after this one with more about the startling genius that is Baked Alaska, the incredible origin story of an alt-right weirdo from out of nowhere. Unbelievable story. Again, we'll be back after station identification in just a minute. Welcome back once again to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We were just speaking before the break of the startling genius that was behind coming up with the Baked Alaska moniker, and how genius it was to recognize that it was indeed genius. You'll recall before the break, damn it, this guy is a genius, says our protagonist here about the guy he was working with, because he was calling him Alaska as he was from Alaska. But he wasn't satisfied with simply being called Alaska. I needed to differentiate myself. I needed to be more unique than Alaska. That's like someone being named Texas or Kentucky. If they're from Texas or Kentucky, yes, you're quite right about that. You have to brand yourself a little more. So I came up with Baked Alaska, because at the time I was a stoner. So I was like the baked kid from Alaska. And it's also a double meaning because it's a dessert. That's hilarious. You are a genius. Lyman said Giannette started as an intern but worked his way into a paid position. I mean, can you imagine, by the way, hearing that explanation for why do you call yourself Baked Alaska? Well, I'm from Alaska and I'm baked, and also it's a dessert. Wow, you should have a paid position. Doing social media and marketing with the Warped Tour. Well, maybe it works for whatever that is. Eventually, however, Giannette left. He said he briefly worked in 2011 for Capitol Records before deciding to pursue a career of his own in music. And that maybe seems more his speed. Giannette developed a rap persona. I like that. I gave it a little A and then I gave it a pop. That he described as a wild, redneck, kick-ass character designed to take the web by storm, as so many redneck, kick-ass characters are these days. He filmed music videos for songs like Alaska Vacation and I Climb Mountains, which featured him wearing outlandish clothing items while rapping alongside scantily clad women. This guy is, in fact, a staggering genius. I can't believe he came up with these ideas for a career in music. He literally turned up as this artist, Baked Alaska. I couldn't believe it, Lyman said. I didn't think he had aspirations of becoming an artist when he worked with me. He never mentioned it. And, of course, they never took root either. He never became an artist. Anyway, the music videos, despite their rich production quality, and I guess we could take a look at them, failed to achieve viral success. It didn't take the web by storm. He didn't design it right. Wow, amazing. Nevertheless, word did get back to Giannette's deeply religious father, who expressed strong disapproval of the content of his music. I've seen some of his stuff in the past, Paul said. Of course, that makes us butt heads, but because I don't approve of the language. That's interesting. I paused there for a second. It says it's copywriting error here. Butt heads. It makes us butt heads. Like B-U-T is what it says. Like, all we are is heads now. We're disembodied heads because I don't approve of the language. What? Oh, I see. 2 T's. That makes us butt heads. Well, you are butt heads, but it also makes you butt heads. This is too much for me. At this point, I'm ready to give up on the article because I can't stand the fact that this guy is able to have any kind of success. He's an idiot. Why do I do anything? I don't know why I work. Anyway, Dad says he knows I'm at odds with his language. I'm at odds with everything he does. You're at odds with the language. Go, Dad. All right, whatever. Giannette was also not happy with his life as a rapper, because he sucked at it probably. He said he became involved in the Los Angeles party scene. Oh, that is tough. And struggled with drugs and alcohol. Darn it. Eventually seeking professional help to get sober. Good for you. He was also discouraged with how things were going with his career and decided to search for other opportunities in the Los Angeles area. That's when he came across a job opening at BuzzFeed. Again, I can't even with this guy. BuzzFeed Motion Pictures needed a social media strategist, he said, and I happened to be the perfect fit for them. He's idiotic, and he had a Twitter account. He got a call about 6 months later. Next up, a new chapter. It's like a Star Wars movie. Giannette had hit a low point in his life. He made the decision to leave Los Angeles for Alaska. Bags packed and on his way to the airport, his phone rang. They saved him from going back to Alaska. I literally had my suitcase packed up, wheeling it down the stairs, he explained. I called the Uber. I was going to move back to Alaska, and I had my suitcase, bringing it into my Uber. I know, you said that. How can you be a social media genius if you can't be concise about the fact that you've got an Uber and you're moving to Alaska? You only have to say it once. This is the second time this has happened. And I'm putting my suitcase in the Uber car. Oh, my God. And I'm like, I get a call, and I'm like, what? And the call was from BuzzFeed. And did I tell you, by the way, he got the call from BuzzFeed. He was wheeling his car. He's literally wheeling his suitcase to the airport. He puts it in an Uber car. I don't know if you know that. I can't believe this. Giannette says it came as a complete surprise. He didn't even remember applying for the job. That's how baked he was, dude. And I was like, if you guys are really serious, I'll cancel my ticket and go interview with you. But if you guys aren't that interested, I don't want to waste my time. You can't waste your time, jackass. And they were like, no, we're really interested. You really fit what we're looking for, and we promise you it won't be a waste of your time. So I was like, okay, cool. So I canceled my plane ticket, went in and interviewed. They loved me, and I got the job right away. And this opened up a new chapter in my life. Initially, Giannette said he loved working for the digital outlet. As a social media strategist, he was responsible for growing BuzzFeed Video's social media accounts, including Tasty, its food video staple that had just launched. Colleagues who worked with him said he was brilliant at his job. Amazing. It's good. Glad he found his niche. He did amazing things. He made the Tasty Instagram and Tasty Twitter. Oh, kissing my fingers like a chef. He's brilliant. And it became like the top 10 account in 6 months, Hood said. Some of that is BuzzFeed's brand, but he's really effing good at social media. Like, it's insane. Working at BuzzFeed Video, Giannette also appeared in the outlet's web videos. With his mullet and distinct clothing style, he became a regular personality. He starred in BuzzFeed's If Your Life Was Making a Murderer video, in addition to taking roles in more traditional productions like Guys Swap Phones for a Day. That's pretty traditional. What the I don't even know what I'm talking about. All right. As politics, though, moved from the backdrop to the forefront of media during the election season, Giannette said he became frustrated with the direction of the outlet. When I started at BuzzFeed, I was making videos about cats and beer pong, okay? By the end of it, it was about feminism and white privilege, he said. I don't know when the shift happened, but something happened in the culture where they were pushing these anti-white, anti-male agendas. Giannette also morphed into a vocal Trump supporter and started to wear his Make America Great Again hat around the office. He even later had Trump's face tattooed on his arm. Let's just say I got a lot of dirty looks and a lot of people stopped inviting me to the meetings. I'm not effing joking, he said. It was really weird once I came out in public as a Trump supporter at BuzzFeed. It was like I was a heretic. I was the guy no one wanted to talk to. All their opinions about me had completely reversed, and it was difficult. They found out how dumb you really were. That shouldn't really surprise you. There is a lot more to this, and I got to tell you, I'm feeling very frustrated in reading this, and it's extremely long, and I don't think I'm going to continue with this thing. But I recommend it to you to read about just how weird it is and how strange he is and how easily he fell into a career being a professional jackass. And I just can't, I don't even understand. I understand falling into a career as a professional jackass, but I don't understand getting started as a jackass. This doesn't make any sense to me. And I resent the hell out of it, and I'm going to start a new political movement to deal with it. But we'll get to that later. What I did want to save some time for, and I don't know how much time I actually need for it, but I want to be cautious and see how much I can get in here. A piece that I thought was very important and a good way to perhaps return to live shows tomorrow in Splinter, splinternews.com. I don't think we've been there before. Alex Perrine, whose name we've seen all over the place, in our Twitter feeds and online and on the show before, wrote this piece, which I think is a little startling in its insight. Charlottesville was a preview for the future of the Republican Party. Now, that's not a difficult conclusion to come to, but I think he states it in a way that makes us say, I genuinely think that they're probably going to continue to float in this direction, but this is the first really solid reasoning I have for it, other than, I don't know, it's happening. So it'll probably continue to happen, that I've seen. This one, let's see, I don't know what the date on this one is, because when I picked it up, it just locked in yesterday, and it's clearly older than yesterday. So I don't know, but it's within the last week or so, obviously, since it's post Charlottesville. He says, I hope you appreciated your recent introduction to the future leadership of the Republican Party this past week. It happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, where hundreds of neo-Nazis and white nationalists marched under the banner of Uniting the Right. Among those white nationalists was James Alsop, a speaker at the rally who was also the president of the Washington State University College Republicans until his resignation this week. He was elected to that position in 2015 and radicalized the organization, according to fellow students. Another attendee was Peter, oh my goodness, look at this name, and you've seen it in print, but it's CV. How do you start? CVJET, Svetanovich. I don't know. You tell me. Is it worth trying to figure out? Probably. Out of courtesy to the rest of his family, who might not be nuts. But there it is. CVJETANOVIC. And I would say, let's say, Jetanovich, Jetanovich. How do you put that together? I'm sure I'm mangling it, but I'm not sure it can not be mangled. He's a college student from Nevada. When photos began circulating of Republican Senator Dean Heller posing for a photo with the avowed white nationalist, it was explained that Heller couldn't have known this jackass's abhorrent beliefs, as the photo op happened merely because this abhorrent jackass was a member of the college Republicans at the University of Nevada at Reno. Okay, fine. I'm far from the first to make this joke, says Alex, but one way Senator Heller might have been able to tell that this kid was racist was that he was a member of the college Republicans. Anyway, I'm not merely being glib. Racial resentment has been a driving force behind college Republican recruitment for years. But at this point, it's really all they have left to offer. In the age of President Donald Trump, what inspires a young person not merely to be conservative or vote Republican, but to get active in organized Republican politics. Do you think it's a fervent belief that Paul Ryan knows the optimal tax policy to spur economic growth? Or do you think it's more likely to be something else? Everything that has happened in American life since the election of George W. Bush, the last point at which the generation currently entering its 30s was up for grabs, has only served to drive young people away from the Republican Party. At the absolute most, based on polling and election data, only about a third of adults under 30 are Republicans. According to Pew, nearly half of those young Republicans left their party at some point in 2016, with 23% of them changing their affiliation for good. Meanwhile, everyone else in the broadly defined millennial generation, and even many among the more conservative Generation X, has become more liberal over the past decade. The Republicans have essentially lost a generation. Republican pollster and author Kristen Soltis Anderson is my favorite authority on this subject because she is watching her own movement refuse to grapple with these facts. Despite that, the Republican Party will continue to field candidates and win elections for the foreseeable future. The two existent parties are entrenched in our electoral system, and they effectively control ballot access at every level, so a Whig-style collapse seems out of the cards. The GOP, despite the aging and eventual die-off of its current base of support, will continue to win lots and lots of elections, so they'll continue to need candidates. Meanwhile, the only people entering the Republican Party as candidates or in the candidate pipeline in the Trump era almost have to be allied with the alt-right, because the alt-right absolutely comprises the only effective and successful youth outreach strategy the GOP currently employs. The future leaders of the GOP aren't the hooded Klan members or Nazi tattooed thugs who presented the most cartoonish faces of hate in Charlottesville, but they are their clean-cut fellow marchers and the many young right-wingers around the nation who sympathize with their cause. While only a few hundred white nationalists descended on Charlottesville to unite the right, and only a couple of those white nationalists have been identified as active college Republicans, college Republican chapters have been signaling their sympathies for the goals of the marchers ever since the rise of the alt-right, and I would say even well before. I mean, how many times have we heard the hackneyed, stupid thing that they keep bringing up of affirmative action bake sales, where the prices are higher based on your race or something like that, or sex or whatever. identifier they're angry about that day. That predated the alt-right, although I guess our Regnery story calls that somewhat into question. But most of these kids weren't digging in Regnery corners 10 years before they enrolled in college. It's something they discovered while they were there. Anyway, it says here, cast your mind back to the time when the greatest threat to free speech in American civic life was liberal students attempting to shut down conservative celebrities on college campuses. What was the actual cause of that spate of stories? It was college Republican groups constantly inviting alt-right darling Milo Yiannopoulos to speak at campuses in order to drum up controversy. It is a trolling tactic, yes, but it is also a pretty clear sign that college Republicans are allied with Milo Yiannopoulos. Elliot Kaufman, writing at the National Review, blames college Republicans for elevating alt-right figures like Milo. He points out that the Columbia College Republicans, surely the last vestige of a legacy admissions drawn to conservative politics mainly to protect their inheritances, right, have already extended speaking invites to Pizzagate propagandist Mike Cernovich and, even more bizarrely, Tommy Robinson, founder of the crypto-fascist English Defense League. They could not be making their affiliations any clearer. The pool of people the Republican Party will be drawing from when selecting candidates a generation from now will contain these men and hardly anyone else. That jackass with the wild name from Nevada, I'm not even going to try it again, wasn't the only marcher photographed with a current Republican elected official. Alsup, the erstwhile WSU College Republicans president, was photographed with Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers. I communicate with people from their office on a fairly regular basis, he told the student newspaper a few months ago, also mentioning that members of his organization had earned internships and jobs in her office. This is the state of the GOP leadership pipeline. In a decade, state legislatures will start filling up with Gamergaters, MRAs, /Paul posters, anime Nazis, and Proud Boys. These are, as of now, the only people in their age cohort becoming more active in Republican politics in the Trump era. Everyone else is fleeing. This will be the legacy of Trumpism. It won't be long before voters who reflexively check the box labeled Republican because their parents did, or because they think their property taxes are too high, or because Fox made them scared of terrorism, whatever it is, start electing Pepe racists to Congress. These future Republican elected officials could easily look very much like rally attendee Nicholas Fuentes, a Boston University student until his decision this week to leave the school. He didn't appear to be a formal member of any young Republican organizations, but he was a self-described Republican. In interviews, he denies being a white supremacist. On Facebook, after the rally, he wrote, "The rootless transnational elite knows that a tidal wave of white identity is coming. That tidal wave represents a fraction of the actual American populace, but it will have an outsized grip on the Republican Party for years to come." And that, I think, is, damn, that's right. They probably will. And so long as the Republican Party retains its position as one of the two entrenched parties in our two-party system, it's really difficult to see where they are going to disappear from the scene. And if they don't, it's really difficult to see where they will get Republican candidate talent other than from people who are willing to self-identify as Republicans. And increasingly, in the younger ranks, it's people who favor the outlandish for whatever reason. And I think it's absolutely true. And he's got the progression right, too. You're going to start to see them in the state legislatures very young, and they're going to be the bench from which the Republican Party nationally recruits their congressional candidates, and then their Senate candidates, and then their presidential candidates. We're going to go through this over and over and over again. Now, one last bit I'll throw in here. Darrell Johnson, on August 21st, published in the Washington Post I warned of right-wing violence in 2009. Republicans objected. I was right. Yes, you were. Let's see. Is there a description down at the bottom that we can give you? Daryl Johnson is the former senior analyst for domestic terrorism at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He now owns DT Analytics, the private consulting company for state and local law enforcement, who only want briefings from people like Sebastian Gorka about Muslim terrorists, apparently. 8 years ago, though, he says, I warned of a singular threat, the resurgence of right-wing extremist activity and associated violence in the United States as a result of the 2008 presidential election, the financial crisis, and the stock market crash. My intelligence report, meant only for law enforcement, was leaked by conservative media. Leakers, you leaker bastards. A political backlash ensued because of an objection to the label right-wing extremism. The report also rightly pointed out that returning military veterans may be targeted for recruitment by extremists. Republican lawmakers demanded then Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano rescind my report. The American Legion formally requested an apology to veterans. Some in Congress called for me to be fired. Amid the turmoil, my warning went unheeded by Republicans and Democrats. Unfortunately, the Department of Homeland Security caved to the political pressure. Work related to violent right-wing extremism was halted. Law enforcement training also stopped. My unit was disbanded, and one by one, my team of analysts left for other employment. By 2010, there were no intelligence analysts at DHS working domestic terrorism threats. Since 2008, though, the body count from numerous acts of violent right-wing terrorism continued to rise steadily, with very little media interest, political discussion, or concern from our national leaders. And as this threat grew, government resources were scaled back. Law enforcement counterterrorism training was defunded, and policies to counter violent extremism narrowed to focus solely on Muslim extremism. It's only gotten worse, of course, under Trump. Heated political campaigning by Donald Trump in 2016 pandered to these extremists, and now right-wing terrorism has become the national security threat which many government leaders have yet to acknowledge. The mere existence of so many heavily armed citizens filled with hate and anger toward various elements of American society is troubling enough in its own right. They number in the hundreds of thousands. More troubling is the violent convergence now underway within right-wing extremist movements, sanitized with the label alt-right. Largely under the media radar, disaffected extremist groups with long histories of squabbling have been independently pooling resources, even some of them even infiltrating our government through the outreach efforts of right-wing extremist groups such as the Oath Keepers and the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. Over the past year, we've witnessed political violence erupt between right-wing extremist protesters and counter-protesters at pro-Trump rallies in Minnesota, Washington, California, and now Virginia. This rebranded alt-right extremist movement has the ultimate goal to disrupt civil society, undermine government institutions, and pick which laws, if any, they will abide by and what supposed justice they will administer on their own authority. But the story, in a very real sense, didn't begin in 2017. As with the Waco and Ruby Ridge sieges during the 1990s, the 2014 Bundy standoff in Nevada, and the 2016 Malheur National Wildlife Refuge siege in Oregon have served not only as recruitment opportunities for anti-government and hate groups, but they also serve as a radicalization facilitator. Wow, that's some phrase. Why? Because extremists in the 2014 and 2016 standoffs were allowed to take up arms against the federal government and threaten law enforcement officers without suffering any legal consequences. More recently, the renewed debates over Confederate monuments, same-sex marriage, and Black Lives Matter has reinvigorated alt-right extremists to mobilize toward a more radical fringe element capable of violent action at any moment. Of further concern, a new generation of charismatic leaders within the white supremacist movement has emerged after Trump's election, creating an opportunity for disparate groups to unite under one banner. Neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan members, militia extremists, and other radical right-wing zealots march side by side at pro-Trump rallies across the country. Trump's endorsement of the border wall, the travel ban, mass deportation of illegal immigrants. These ideas were touted on white supremacist message boards nearly 10 years ago, but now they're being put forth as official U.S. policy. Such controversial plans have placated white supremacists and anti-government extremists and will draw still more sympathetic individuals toward these extremist causes, along with the sort of violent acts that too often follow, like Charlottesville. Rhetoric from the president has further emboldened the alt-right. After the violence in Charlottesville, former KKK leader David Duke welcomed President Trump's remarks. Thank you, President Trump, for your honesty and courage to tell the truth about Charlottesville and condemn the leftist terrorists in BLM/Antifa. Similarly, other white nationalists praised the president for not attacking them. America finds itself overwhelmed with domestic terrorist attacks, increased terrorist plotting, and the emergence of new polarizing political issues. Meanwhile, the U.S. government has not only failed to implement an effective strategy to combat right-wing terrorism, it is afraid to even raise the subject in public for fear of political backlash or contradicting its narrow-minded terrorism narrative, e.g., terrorism only comes from Muslims. Extremists no longer hide anymore. They number in the hundreds of thousands and are extremely well armed. The political apparatus and the news media appears confused in their reporting of the scope of the domestic terrorist threat, some ignoring it completely. When 9/11 happened, the government made an effort to connect the dots beforehand, but failed because of a lack of communication among agencies. In this case, the government is even trying, and worse, it appears to be enabling the threat to flourish. The Islamist militants who brought down the World Trade Center's Twin Towers 16 years ago, or the ones who rammed their vehicles into pedestrians in London, Paris, and Barcelona recently, had no domestic constituency. Their acts weren't enshrined instantly on social media or obliquely heralded by the president, duly elected representatives, or rationalized by media ideologues dead set on preventing a political backlash. The terrorists I have dedicated my life to stopping have had all that going in their favor. This is more than a formula for disaster. It virtually invites the disaster upon us. Pretty sobering, and pretty sobering in combination with Alex Perrine's article as well. It's a rough place to have to leave it, and I guess at this point I would have to encourage you to please do go back and read the rest of the article about Baked Alaska, and perhaps, maybe, sorta, kinda, that'll put you a little bit more at ease knowing how many of them are absolute goofballs, and these are guys who have risen to some serious prominence in the movement. We can't stress that too much. They do rise and fall pretty quickly, but then there's also another one always waiting in line next to them. And if they begin to learn from their mistakes, I don't even know what to tell you, what to expect in the future. But the slickest of them will begin graduating, hiding their tattoos, and running for office pretty shortly, and showing up in state legislatures all over the place, and of course being handed cookie-cutter legislation by ALEC, a threat we've already identified and discussed extensively on the show. It's not a very encouraging picture. Sometimes it's a little bit bleak, but on the other hand, it's nothing a little money couldn't solve. Isn't that odd? And it's so strange that all of it ends up on one side of the debate, but I guess it stands to reason. We've talked about how it is that rich people spend their money, and of course one of the things they're willing to spend money on is lobbying hard so that they don't have to part with any more of their money, or they get lots of that money come back to them through other means. For instance, like things we haven't discussed yet, and I'm sure we'll discuss them on Thursday and Friday, the scheme finally coming to light with Donald Trump bankrupting the Secret Service. As we finally realize every time he and his kids go on vacation, they make money, $60,000 worth of golf cart rentals to protect him while he's playing golf. Amazing.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Man, I could hardly get that one out. I'm so outraged about that. Anyway, this wraps up the last of our pre-recorded shows. I am hopeful that all goes well and I have a pleasant trip home, and I'm in shape to speak to you live Thursday morning and be joined by Greg Dworkin as the kids head back for another academic year, freeing us up in the mornings. I will talk to you then.